Greetings, everyone. We're just about to get started. My name is Ian Stewart. I'm a professor of humanities here at the University of King's College in the History of Science and Technology program. Welcome, everyone, to this this session, Critical Perspectives from Indian Ocean Worlds. We're going to just a couple of process notes. We're going to reserve the Q&A for the end of the session because this is a panel that's been designed to be somewhat integrated internally. And we are just having a slight technical difficulty insofar as we're waiting for the second and the third papers to get queued onto this computer. So we're going to begin with Sebestian Kroupa from McGill University. We've agreed that we would just let speakers quickly introduce themselves and who they're what they're speaking on. So I will be moderating from here with the 5-minute one. And now we have actually until 11:15, so we'll try to leave. Would 20 minutes be good for Q&A? Is that acceptable to you? Yeah. Okay. So I'll do the back calculation. So.
Thank you Ian, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. So my name is Sebestian Kroupa. I'm assistant professor at the Department of Social Studies of Medicine at McGill University, and I work on early modern histories of medicine and life sciences in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, with a particular focus on the Philippines, about which we will hear today. My paper today draws on some of the materials that I am currently trying to rework into one of the chapters for the monograph that I'm currently writing about how nature of the Philippines was constructed, commodified, and globalized in the early modern era. So I would be especially grateful for any comments and feedback. But let's begin. In the late 17th century, monsoon winds carried merchants to Manila in the Spanish Philippines every autumn, with their ships laden with goods from the east coast of India. Their arrival was eagerly anticipated by the locals, including the Bohemian Jesuits pharmacist Joseph Camel. One winter in 1696, these sailors delivered an unexpected parcel addressed specifically to Camel. In it, he found a letter from Samuel Brown, a surgeon in the services of the English East India Company, who was stationed in its outpost of Fort St. George in present-day Chennai. Brown described how he had learned from traders about a Jesuit in Manila working on a catalogue of Philippine flora. In hopes of establishing correspondence, Brown decided to reach out. He was partly driven by his own interests in medical botany and partly acting on behalf of James Petiver, one of his patrons in London, who constantly spurred Brown to recruit new correspondents. As his letter of introduction, Petiver asked Brown to enclose a catalogue which advertised the vast range of correspondence and natural specimens that Petiver had already gathered in different parts of the world. By responding to this initial letter, Camel became the newest acquisition in this worldwide network. My paper will use exchanges between Camel and Petiver to briefly interrogate the model of knowledge circulation. Over the last 20 years, this approach has helped us build more inclusive and global histories of science. Historians of colonial science have found the concept especially helpful in deconstructing the oversimplified categorization of knowledge into that of the colonizer and the colonized. Yet by privileging knowledge that travels, this paradigm has also yielded distorted views of interconnected worlds or of centers of accumulation that attract knowledge and power almost like magnets. Many scholars have noted that such portrayals of smooth circulation and accumulation do not tend to encourage critical analysis of the power relations involved in knowledge making. Indeed, in many cases, circulation seems to have come to embody relatively passive flows of things around instead of active acts of communication, translation, and negotiation. And in that light, knowledge networks then frequently appear as inert, geographically distributed, and relatively disembodied structures that simply shuffle things around and facilitate the accumulation of information and power in different centers, which are located typically in the West. Such portrayals of networks tend to flatten the human agency involved rather than representing systems of human interaction as they should. So instead of treating camel and vetiver as nodes of circulation and accumulation, I try to place emphasis on the act of communication or the link between them to bring back into focus the wide range of agencies that underpins the production and movements of knowledge. By shifting from static centers to dynamic exchanges, we not only gain deeper insights into the complexities of communicating knowledge on a worldwide scale, but also come to accentuate the fragile nature of the underlying actions. The transactions between camel and vetiver reveal how conflicts, self-interest, and environmental factors limited the distance that networks could bridge. At the same time, frictions and disconnections could prove surprisingly productive, prompting actors to devise creative solutions and even leading to new connections. So rather than a world of smooth circulations, my paper shows one of frictions and tentative missed and broken connections, which highlight how challenging it was for actors to make knowledge travel. I will first briefly discuss vetiver's activities before examining how camel and vetiver established trans-imperial communications between Manila and London, and finally explore the role of this connection in knowledge communication. But first, James Vetiver. The scale of the natural historical enterprise that Vetiver managed to build was rather impressive. He assembled one of the largest correspondence networks of his time, amassed a monumental collection of specimens, and kept himself in the periodicals business for more than a decade at a time, when similar projects were typically short-lived. Vetiver, who came from a family of tradesmen, was trained in pharmacy, and opened a shop in London shortly after 1685. Despite his middling origins and the lack of higher education, Vetiver earned a successful professional career, active membership in the Royal Society, and the friendship of leading English scholars, including Hans Sloane and John May. Recent studies have revised the earlier depictions of Vetiver as a rather boorish and disorganized hoarder of specimens, portraying him instead as a diligent and skilled naturalist, collector, and especially networker. To contribute to the project of building a universal repository of natural knowledge, Vetiver set to recruit collectors from all walks of life, including both men and women across social standings, from genteel amateurs and medical practitioners to merchants, clerks, and artisans. For that reason, James Del Burgo described Vetiver's enterprise as an early example of crowdsourcing of science on a global scale. To develop a worldwide infrastructure for recruiting collectors and amassing specimens, Vetiver took advantage of England's growing commercial and colonial networks. Two of the collectors he recruited were Samuel Brown and Edward Bulkley, surgeons in the services of the English East India Company stationed in Fort St. George, who also became mediators in the link between Manila and London. Having learned about both Brown's and Bulkley's interests in natural history through mutual acquaintances, Vetiver solicited them to send natural specimens and observations to India in exchange for, quote, what returns you shall desire, end quote, as well as acknowledgements in his periodicals, as you can see on the slide. His publications enumerated the specimens Vetiver had received, praising his associates for their contributions to the advancement of science, all the while casting Vetiver as a well-connected broker located at the center. For that reason, Vetiver's projects have recently been summed up as a one-man accumulation center. Yet I'd like to quickly emphasize that these cycles of accumulation were not smooth or infinite. The exchanges with Bulkley show that Vetiver's growing network and increasing desirability as a correspondent had an adverse impact on his ability to act like one. As ever-growing piles of letters and specimens from different associates were awaiting reply, Vetiver struggled to meet Bulkley's requests, so much so the surgeon shifted his allegiance to other patrons. Either way, Vetiver managed to amass a vast assortment of specimens and papers, which was eventually acquired by his patron Hans Sloane, who later gifted his collection to the British nation in a bequest that laid the foundations of the British Museum. The rest of my paper will highlight the troublesome nature of the processes that underlie such making of the global or of the image conveyed by large European collections. Moving on to Camel in Manila, as we heard in my opening, he was recruited into the network by Brown, who both corresponded with Camel on his own behalf and acted as a conduit between the Jesuit and Petiver. After Brown died in 1698, his colleague Bulkley took over the role. Over the next 10 years, Camel dispatched to London some 3,000 descriptions, 1,000 images, and 300 specimens of Philippine nature, many of which appeared in Petiver's periodicals and the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society. Camel's communications were especially valuable for Petiver since Philippine nature was largely unknown to European scholarship. Yet Camel did not just passively submit knowledge to Petiver in expectation of their rewards. Instead, he used Petiver as a mediator to build his own networks in London and approached the prominent naturalist John Day, whose work Camel admired. He was familiar with Bay's monumental publication, Historia Plantarum, or the History of Plants, which he saw at a friend several years ago and considered a work supremely brilliant for which all posterity will give deserved credit. When Camel received Petiver's letter from London, where he knew that Historia had been published, he decided to try to approach Ray in search of intellectual exchange and a copy of the book. Perhaps Camel had heard from Brown that Petiver worked with Ray, perhaps it was a shot in the dark. Either way, when Camel's first shipment arrived in London, Petiver forwarded Camel's letter to Ray and asked Brown to inform Camel that, quote, Mr. Ray has his letter and papers and has promised me to answer them, end quote. In more practical terms, how did the Bohemian Jesuit in Spanish Manila exchange knowledge with English Protestant scholars in London? The connection between London and Port St. George was relatively straightforward, with East India Company ships regularly sailing between the two. Yet communicating between Port St. George and Manila was considerably more challenging. England and Spain were not exactly best friends throughout early modernity. The English East India Company repeatedly sought the permission to enter the lucrative Manila market, where American silver was traded for Chinese silk, porcelain, and other luxuries. However, these efforts failed due to Spanish protectionist policies, which banned European rivals from trading in Spanish ports. Still, a bustling surreptitious commerce developed between English settlements and Spanish Manila, as recorded by the merchants Thomas Bowery. Great stores are transported and vended into the South Seas, more especially to Manila, one of the Molucca Isles belonging to the King of Spain, but are sent thither in the name and under the colors of the Portugals born and bred in India, no others being admitted at free trade thither, and especially the English. So to exchange shipments, Camel and his peers had to tap into networks of Indian Ocean trade that lay outside European colonial control. The connection with Camel relied on the ventures of merchants born in Asia who had free access to the Manila market, especially Armenian, Indian, and Indo-Portuguese traders. Port St. George emerged as a major center of this clandestine trade, and the authorities in Manila embraced the illicit traffic in the face of Spanish royal decrees, as it proved a welcome source of goods and profits. Asian merchants therefore provided the fragile infrastructure upon which it hinged the successes of European colonial and learning projects, as well as the transactions of knowledge across the frontiers of two rival European empires. The activities of these go-betweens were contingent on local and momentary patronage, including, but not restricted to, that from European sources. Now, even with commercial ventures providing the infrastructure for moving knowledge around, this was a fragile world with many disruptions in communication caused by the caprices of both the environment and the humans involved. Agents and their communications were at the mercy of the seasonality of winds and currents, which determined shipping schedules and stopover patterns. The exchanges between Manila and London followed the rhythms of monsoons. Ships traveling eastwards to the Indian subcontinent and to Manila relied on the summer currents, which reversed their direction in the winter. The return voyage from Manila was especially tricky, with at least two reverse changes of wind, which often required ships to take shelter in Macau or the Malacca Straits for weeks or even months. Even under ideal circumstances, moving a package from one end to the other took 15 months, which affected what the shipments could include. The stopover in India also faced its dangers. In the winter of 1698, Brown died before he could forward Camel's shipments to Petiver. Both Petiver and Camel then solicited help from Bulkley to locate the stray parcel, which was eventually sent to London by Brown's widow. It finally arrived in 1701, 3 years after Camel had originally dispatched it, and with several parts missing. That same year, Bulkley complained that Petiver's package for Camel was delivered on board a ship that had first passed through the Bay of Bengal. And it is unclear whether this detour was down to commercial opportunities or unfavorable winds, but either way, the parcel arrived too late to be shipped to Manila that year and has to spend another year in Port St. George. Using ships to exchange consignments also required hiring couriers, and finding reliable ones proved challenging. Their task included protecting collections from the adverse weather conditions and the bustle on board the ships. Judging from the regular complaints about specimens damaged by seawater, heat, and physical impact, this was no easy feat. Moreover, given the value of what they often carried, couriers sometimes succumbed to the temptation to pilfer parts of the shipments to make extra profits. Indeed, Camel lamented the loss of a parcel which included his most desired item, a copy of Ray's story of Montaro, carried on the ship of a certain Goody Ignacio the Armenian. The word Goody is a corruption of the honorific Persian title Khoja, which designated a prominent independent merchant. However, Ignacio did not live up to his honorific title. He refused to hand over the consignment, claiming that the contents were for himself, regardless of Camel's protests. Despite Ignacio's daylight robbery, Camel still had no choice but to rely on the Armenian for the return shipments to Fort St. George. So couriers like Ignacio could both facilitate and break connections in knowledge networks. An even greater tragedy struck Camel a few years earlier. After he had dispatched his life's work to Ray and Petiver in London, he lamented that the ship was assailed by pirates, and the evidence of 10 years of my labors, I fear, was lost in a single day. The waters between Manila and the state of Malacca were notoriously dangerous and riddled, among others, with Dutch privateers. Yet this unlucky incident brought Camel into communication with another correspondent. Just a few months later, he received an unexpected letter from Willem ten Reyne, a Dutch physician stationed in Batavia, present-day Jakarta. Ten Reyne described how he had recently come across Camel's drawings as they wandered through the streets of Batavia, and then mourned when he learned that they had fallen into inappropriate hands. Ten Reyne, an experienced medical and botanical author, was so impressed by Camel's work that he urged the Jesuit to publish it in Europe. He promised Camel a safer and faster route to Europe via Dutch East India Company ships, which would take Camel's works directly to ten Reyne's contacts in Holland, who would handle the publication. Despite being enemies in both politics and faith, Camel obliged and expedited to Batavia the remainder of his work, which he was preparing to dispatch to London instead. Camel's English associates were less than impressed by this shift in allegiance. They lamented to Petiver that Camel has not dealt ingeniously in delivering his work to another, which he gave a kind of a trouble for. Yet in shipping his work to ten Reyne, Camel only extended his streak of bad luck, as the Dutchman had died before the consignment reached Batavia. With the utmost effort and a bit of luck, Camel managed to recover the stray shipments and forward his work to London, just in time for it to be appended to the third volume of Ray's story of Montaro. As soon as the news of ten Reyne's death reached London, Petiver lost no time and tasked Bulkley to, quote, endeavor inquiry after what ten Reyne has left and strike it procurable. The dismay over the appearance of the rival patron swiftly turned into an opportunity to obtain whatever could be pilfered from his earthly possessions once he had departed. Not even in death did early modern nationalists find peace. Soon after this episode, the War of the Spanish Succession broke out in Europe in 1701, pitching Spain and England into an open conflict. They shared his fears with Petiver that the wars will interrupt epistolary commerce with Manila. And indeed, the busy surreptitious trade between East India Company outposts and Manila quickly broke down. Sporadic ventures of the neutral Armenians through Macau enabled Bulkley and Camel to exchange a few more shipments, but in 1706, Bulkley admitted to Petiver that he had not seen a ship from Manila in the last 2 years. Later that year, Camel died in Manila, aged just 45. Given the breakdown in communication, his correspondents in London did not learn about his sorry fate until 4 years later, in 1710. To very briefly conclude, the world of early modern knowledge exchanges was marked by frictions and tentative, missed and broken connections. The process of making knowledge travel was highly arduous and fraught with challenges and anxieties for those involved. Correspondents had to be intimately familiar with shipping schedules dictated by seasonal winds, currents, and commercial opportunities. Even with the tenuous infrastructure in place, individuals had to grapple with the hazards of long-distance transport, including piracy and adverse weather, as well as conflict and tensions among the correspondents, couriers, and countries. Although early modernity brought more intensive movements of people, objects, and information on increasingly global scales, such mobilizations required enormous material and human investments. Movement was not the default property of knowledge, and networks were not machines that moved around objects and information seamlessly. Yet despite the challenges posed by communicating knowledge, frictions and broken connections could also foster the correspondence inventiveness and engender new connections. Shifting from interconnected to disconnected worlds therefore helps us bring to the fore the human and environmental agencies involved and highlight the complex reality of overlapping yet distinct networks in which knowledge traveled at specific times, but not at others. Thank you.
Go straight to Minakshi. So Minakshi Menon from McGill University as well.
If you just show me how to connect, yes, because I had to pull the slides myself. Are we using your computer?
Minakshi.
Okay, let's run this one first. Let's run this one first. I can just find out.
We started late, so we have a 15-minute break after this session before the next session. So with your indulgence, to allow the speakers to not be unduly harangued by time, I'm just going to allow the session to go into this delay. That's here. So you need to leave the break.
We'll be here, we can do that, move them for you.
In action, try to keep you to 18 minutes, just so that we have some time to talk. Okay?
18 minutes?
Yeah.
I'll do my best.
That's what everyone has. Okay, so if there's to be any Q&A that's necessary, so I would be.
I will do my best. And we all. Oh, yeah, I will just walk over. This is also we have past this and Good morning and thank you for coming. I'm very sorry about the delay, but technical issues. So, here's my title, Fiction and Translation, Identifying Plants in the Indian Ocean Works. And here's a common about the definition of translation and how it is working. Let me begin by providing a bit of context for this paper. Over the last few years, I've been working on a monograph with the title Emperor's Empire, National Knowledge Making, State Making and Governance in the East India Company, India, 1784 to 1830. Its main theme is colonial botany, and the first half of the book examines philological knowledge making about Indian plants by British colonial savants, among them Sir William Jones and Henry Thomas Schoolwood. Now, I've been particularly struck by the orthographic and paleographic difficulties encountered in reading the Sanskrit texts they collected. My eyes have had to work hard, and I've noticed how engaging in this sort of philological observation, quote unquote, makes enormous demands on my focus and concentration. And it leads me to make all sorts of mistakes. This, in turn, has made me reflect on the various practices that British Orientalists in India had to develop to move knowledge across linguistic boundaries while translating Sanskrit lexicons into English. And the example I have for you here is the famous verse lexicon, the Amarakosha, which was composed circa 500 CE. While reading critical literature on Sanskrit translation, I came across a really obscure little article by the famous Indologist and Tibetologist, Ronald Emmerich, in which he describes how the Cotonese version of Ravi Gupta's medical lexicon and the Sanskrit word for that is Nikhanda was made from the Tibetan translation. Oops. What happened? Thank you. In case anyone wants to know, Cotonese is a kind of Middle Iranian. Is Elise here? Middle Iranian, right? Yes. Oh. Okay, so let me keep going with this.
Yeah, the thing is that what's happening is that you guys are connected to the wrong session.
Let's
continue.
Let's undo the slides. Okay, so we should be on slide 3.
Right, but yeah.
So I mentioned the Cotonese version of Ravi Gupta's Nikhanda, which was made from a Tibetan translation. Now, this is the manuscript in question, the book, is something called the Siddhasara, which was composed between 600 and 800 CE. The earliest systematically arranged medical treatise in Sanskrit, which Ravi Gupta composed, and it was based on his reading of 2 of 3 great books of Ayurveda, the Charaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita. Emmerich's complicated article is distinguished by witty asides on how early modern translators read texts, what caused them to fall into error, and so on. In short, it describes the micro practices involved in communicating knowledge across linguistic boundaries. And here I emphatically agree with what Jim Seaford said in the previous talk, which is circulation is a subset of communication, not the other way around. So here's the problem Emmerich addresses. There are numerous instances where the Cotonese version shows a correct understanding of the original Sanskrit, while the Tibetan translation is an error. Why is that? And if the Khotanese translator knew Sanskrit, then why consult the Tibetan version at all? The answer requires positing alternative explanations and choosing among them, which could only have been done by a modern scholar learned in textual commentaries and proficient in the use of medical lexicons, which Erich was. He was a real expert. Now, what Erich does, in effect, is to reconstruct the way the Khotanese translator made his choices and used his judgment to overcome obvious problems, that is, the frictions, that dogged his efforts to make a correct translation. Some identifications of the plant names in the text made by the translators are bad, others are surprisingly good. So this haphazard approach leads Erich to rule out the use of commentaries, which usually offer explanations of the synonyms of plant names, as well as alternative readings of the concerned text. He concludes that the Khotanese translator or translators had access to a Nikanda other than the one attached to the Siddhasara document they were translating. The plant names that he had to clarify are in chapter 2 of the Siddhasara, which deals with a group of drugs, and according to Erich, is the dullest of all the 31 chapters in the text. Apparently, the ancient translators were equally bored and wearied by the process of consulting the Siddhasara's two Nikandas. The slightest similarity to a word they knew or thought they knew, says Erich, must have provided a breath of relief. In a high proportion of cases, their desperation was such that they could do no more than offer a transcription. Now, here's an example from the Aloe group of drugs. It's a group of drugs in, okay, slide right? No, good, slide. So, and I've explained it there. A group of drugs which is called Kandash Kala. Now, the word itself, needing translation, proved too much for the Tibetans, who offered Chandan Dan Yashkala Dan, reading Chanda as Chandana, that is Sanskrit sandalwood, a familiar item traded on the Silk Route, and thereby banalizing it, not recognizing Yashkala, they simply transcribe it. And so we have their translation, sandalwood and Yashka. The Khotanese translator did better. He adopted the Tibetan mistranslation of Chanda as Chandana, but he undoes the Sanghi, that is the merging of the two words, and there's a lot of Sanskrit grammar involved in that, but he undoes the merging of Kanda and Chanda and Ayas, splitting it into two, producing two words, Chanda and Ayash. He then goes on to read Ayash, literally, as iron, turning it into filings of iron for good measure. Nevertheless, he does recognize that we are dealing with three words here and not two. And Ayash, I should tell you, is actually a synonym for Agaloch, the Sanskrit aguru, which is the aloe wood and tree. Now, I'll stop here with this example, my first example of friction in translation, move on to my second one, which is by the British Orientalist Sir William Jones, who made great efforts to identify the Indian spikenard through a method which I have elsewhere called, quote unquote, philological empiricism. That method carefully united scrutiny of others' linguistic words, teasing out forms of experience encoded in their descriptive practices, to observe observational methods, observational modes that privileged trained seeing, that is autopsia, whether of orthography or of plant parts. Jones wrote two essays on the Indian spikenard. The first was on the spikenard of the ancients. The second one was additional remarks on the spikenard of the ancients, composed around 1794, published after his death in the Asiatic Researches. Now, on the spikenard is an exercise in humanist philology with the aim of discovering what words in Indian languages, but particularly in Sanskrit, could tell you about things. The essay is written to prove that the plant called Jatamansi in Sanskrit text is the same as the plant called Sambul in Arabic, which is the nard of the ancients. Now, to stabilize the identification of the Jatamansi and Sambul, Jones makes virtuous readings of Greek and Latin texts and compares them to Persian sources, which use the word nard. He then explains that according to his pundits, nard is never used as a noun in Sanskrit. The reader is invited to enter into his chain of reasoning and judge the strength of the case made for the identity of the spike analysis. Equals Jatamansi equals Sambul in Linnean terms as a Valeriana, that is Valeriana Jatamansi. Jones's authority of first resort in his hunt for the spikenard was the verse lexicon, the Amarkosha, of which he produced an interlinear translation. What I'd like to do here is to take us into the Amarkosha manuscript and follow the stages of his efforts to identify the plant lexically. The Jatamansi was one of the few cases where Jones did not examine a plant he described with his own eyes. It is, however, a case where we can track his philology at work through his annotations. His Amarkosha manuscript records all the names of the Jatamansi. So he writes down all the names of the Jatamansi, and you can see them there, and then he translates them in his own hand. Against the vertical list, he writes, Jatamansi, the true spikenard, it's on the left, a fragrant medicinal root. He would later conclude that the dried Jatamansi of the spice bazars was the whole plant and not the root. All the Sanskrit synonyms of the plant, we should notice, refer to a particular morphological character, the plant's fibrous leaf bases, which give it its unique appearance of matted locks of hair. Further up the list, but still in the one Aushadhi Varga, the section on woods and herbs in the Amara is an entry for gonad. Against which appears the following annotation in a different darker ink. Down there, cow's nard or earth nard with a large cross placed against them. Directly below the gonad is a phrase from a Sanskrit commentary, which I still have not, I haven't identified the commentary, but it's accompanied by a Latin translation, Aguan Retinari Prasit makes the water echo, followed by two synonyms for gonad in Bengali and Sanskrit. And to the right, there is a terse phrase, I don't know if you can see it, Govardhan from the commentary, he says, referring to the pundit who is assisting him. And this is another source of friction, and I've got lots of manuscript evidence that the pundits weren't entirely frank with him about communicating everything that they should have. Especially when they were giving him glosses from commentaries, they did some naughty work, they did try to confuse him. The resolution of the problem of connecting word and thing only occurred, however, when Jones asked his friend, a Mr. Law, who resided at Gaya in Bihar, to procure fresh plants from Nepal, which were accidentally planted in the garden of another friend, a Mr. Bird. This was a man whose affiliation Jones trusted, and who sent him a plant on the basis of which, next slide please, of which Jones triumphantly made a diagnosis in the Linnean style, Valeriana Jatamansi, Floribus triangulus, Paulus cordated, Quaternis radicalibus petulatus, 3 stamens, 4 heart-shaped seeds with 5 stalks. Notice though that the drawing of the plant does not show the, could we do a slide then? Yeah, that's it. Notice though that the drawing of the plant does not show the fibrous leaf bases, the distinguishing marker of the Jatamansi, which generated its Sanskrit synonyms. This is where matters stood in April 1794 when he died, but it didn't end there. In November 1794, the superintendent of the Calcutta Botanic Garden, William Roxburgh, received 2 small baskets of Jatamansi plants from the British Commissioner of Coot Bihar in Bengal. The plants procured from Bhutan were planted in the Botanic Garden, where they were closely observed by Roxburgh. Now, he penned a clear description of them as they grew, and I'll leave you to read it so that I don't have to. And he linked the description to a figure he had drawn. These notes may be the first description of a fresh specimen of the true spikenard, known to botanists today as Nardistachys jatamansi D. Don DC. An appropriate binomial may have been nigh when a mishap occurred. Please read that. The plants died, in short. So the death of the plants was a disaster. So what did Roxburgh do? He decides, although he had the true Jatamansi under his eye and seen its leaves taking shape, to defer to Berg's drawing of the Valeriana Jatamansi, indicating the importance of autopsia through the European knowledge-making collective in India to which he and Jones belonged. He may have hesitated to conclude that the final shape of the leaves of the mature plant, would be similar to the shape, this is what he saw, of the immature leaves. Because a change in place, a translation of the plants to the Calcutta Botanic Garden, could certainly produce changes in plant habit. But he does more. He creates this drawing of the roots and spike-like body which he had seen of the true spikenard, which resembles an ermine's tail. And he pastes an image of Berg's Valeriana Jatamansi on top, creating a cobbled together monster, which would continue to mislead botanists for another few years. And so there you have it, friction in translation. Next slide, that's the true Jatamansi. Thank you.
I think because the lack of time, I'm just going to start.
As we're setting up this.
Well,
And Winterbottom from McGill.
Thank you very much. So, my work focuses on the circulation of early modern material medicine. And in the last few years, we've had a series of really interesting case studies of material medica like ginseng, cinchona, rhubarb, and more, and how they moved around. So early people in the pre-modern world were also interested in movements. But as somebody mentioned at the opening talk last night, they were particularly interested in places of origin. So where did things come from? So in this paper, I use aloe vera as the case study of why place was important in pre-modern medicine and how that changed beginning from the early modern period, how that was replaced by the idea of species being essentially the same across time and space. So, and like a lot of pre-modern drugs, aloe vera is very present in the modern marketplace. When we see aloes in modern products, it's almost invariably aloe vera that we see. Now this has led to the popular assumption that aloe vera was also prepared historically. ChatGPT will tell you it was known for thousands of years and widely used. And like most things that ChatGPT tells you, that's not true. The aloe that was preferred in the pre-modern world was, just to say that this has also had an effect on scientific work. So scientific studies also start, including this major one at Kew, from the premise that aloe vera was the preferred species in the pre-modern world. And this is problematic because In fact, the aloe that was preferred, sorry, I lost this. The aloe that was preferred in the pre-modern world came not from the, it can't be identified with aloe vera, rather it came from the small Indian Ocean island of Socotra. Socotra is just south of mainland Yemen and to the east of the Horn of Africa. And like many island environments, it's the source of unique plant species. And it supplied two very important medicinal products to the pre-modern world. One of the, this is where Socotra is. It supplied two very important medicinal products to the pre-modern world. One of them was dragon's blood, which is the resin of a tree that's endemic to Socotra, and there it is. And this is it in its packaged form, so you see it's packaged in these small tiers. And the other one was the Circulating aloe. So the Circulating aloe can be roughly identified with aloe perry, which you see on the slide here. Of course, it doesn't match up entirely because of the difference between classifications and historical descriptions. And this is what it looks like in its packaged form. So early medical writings suggest that Circulating aloes were preferred for internal uses. Here we have Dioscorides. He mentions aloes growing in India, but the historian of Roman medicine, John Scarborough, has convincingly argued that this is actually a reference to the Circulating aloe. So we have the Circulating aloe here. We also have a substitute growing on Andros. And sorry, could we get back? So Al-Razi, who wrote in the 10th century, mentions specifically the Circulating aloe being used for internal use. And again, we have another substitute, this case, the Arabian aloe, which is used for wound cleaning. Thank you. So aloes were traded very widely. By at least the 10th century, we see them appearing in works on Chinese medicine. And in the 13th century, Zhufanzi, the place of origin is also described as Zongyu, and this is a place-based categorization which includes the Horn of Africa and Yemen. So again, we have this focus on where the aloes came from, and a consensus across quite different medical cultures that the best kind of aloes came from Socotra. Aloes appeared in Indian works of medicine by about the 13th century, and they're also described by Garcia de Orta, who was in India in the 16th century. And he talks about Indian aloes as a type of aloes that were used in medicine, and they also appear in pharmacopoeia, both in Indian languages and in Arabic. So here we have another substitute, Indian aloes. But Garcia de Orta emphasizes that Circulating aloes were still much more valuable even in India, so they would sell for 3 times the price of the local product. So to sum up what I've said so far, there was a pre-modern preference for Circulating aloes, although a number of substitutes were available. And there was also a focus on place, which we see across several different medical cultures. So in the West, this stems ultimately from the work of Hippocrates and his heirs, orders and phases. This idea that environments will transmit aspects of themselves to the material medical that grow there. And we can see this, a similar idea coming out of quite different medical cultures. So for example, in China, Chinese scholars have noted the emergence from the Song period onwards of this idea of dowdies, so place-based authenticity. Just to continue, aloes had also reached Europe by the medieval period, and mostly through Jewish trading networks. One of the key reasons for European expansion in the early modern period was the search for more direct access to medicinal commodities, including those we now understand as spices. And Circassian aloes were actually among the commodities that Columbus hoped to find when he aimed to sail towards Asia and ended up in the New World. Instead, what he found was agave, which we see on the next slide. So as you can see, agave looks very similar to aloe. It's not actually a good substitute because the leaves don't produce gel, they produce fiber. And this also became a colonial commodity, but this wasn't a good substitute for aloe. We can go forward again, please. So aloe was by the early 17th century very widely transplanted. This was the common aloe. And it grew in a lot of the Caribbean, so including the Dutch colonies of Aruba, Kroupa, and Bonaire, which you see to close to Venezuela there. And by the 17th century, it was also growing in Jamaica and Barbados. And it was often exported in these gourds, which I talked about last night. So we'll go to the next slide. And you can see here the comparison that Hans Sloane made. This is a drawing from the Hans Sloane herbarium between aloe and agave. And so this is where the idea of aloe vera comes from. Aloe is the true aloe because it's not agave, right? So this is the origin of the idea of aloe vera. And it was because of this confusion that Abraham Munting, who was the first person to write in detail about aloe, coined the name Aloe vera vulgaris for the common aloe, which he illustrates. Importantly, Munting's name for the Circadian aloe was Aloe vera majora. So aloe vera from Aloe vera majoris was meant to be the Circadian aloe. It lost that title because of an episode of botanical confusion, which was caused, I'm going to skip over that one, by some South African products entering the market. This is one of them, Cape aloes, also very widely traded from the 17th century onwards. It originated from Khoikhoi medicine, but it was traded internationally by the Dutch from the Cape. It was also grown by a combination of Khoikhoi laborers and enslaved people. Traded very widely. This is of what became Aloe soccatrina, and it entered European gardens from the botanical garden at the Cape of Good Hope. It was mistakenly identified as the Circassian aloe, and this persisted, this confusion persisted for about 200 years. And the reason for this was that Circassia was becoming an obscure place for European merchants because the Red Sea region trade was dominated at that time by merchants from Western India. So European botanists didn't have access to living plants, and there was some confusion around this. Up until the 19th century, the sources of aloe continued to multiply, and they were often still designated by place-based titles. But if you could go to the next slide, this gradually changed over the course of the 19th century, and I argue that there were several reasons for this. One of them is the domination of the concept of species. Another one is the isolation of active ingredients. So the active ingredient that was isolated from aloes, there's aloe, and it was isolated in 1851. For a while, people would talk about sock aloe and barb aloe and so on. So the place-based designations actually carried over into discussions of aloe. But by the time there was a resurgence of interest in aloes and aloe in the 20th century, the consensus was that they were basically the same across space. So the aloe is just aloe, and aloe is just aloe. So just go to my last slide. So where does aloe vera come from? The plant, it's still a mystery. Maybe we can identify it with the aloe that Dioscorides described on Andros, the Arabian aloe that Al-Razi talks about, or the Indian aloe that entered circulation from the 13th century. The concept of aloe vera is easier to trace. It was coined in the 17th century because of the confusion between aloe and agave. And because of the confusion caused by the South African plant, aloe vera became applied only to the common aloe, what was known earlier as the common aloe. In a broader sense, the importance of place in pre-modern medicine was gradually displaced by the concept of species and active ingredients. But in practice, place remains very important as for those who produce medicine. And so I argue in the paper that one of the reasons that Barbados and the Cape became the foci for the international trade in aloes is because of African expertise in cultivating aloe, both at the Cape and in the Caribbean. Thanks very much.
Many thanks to the disciplined time keeping of the various three speakers. So let's open up the floor for questions. It's better from the stand, so I'll do that. Though if there's specific questions addressed to specific speakers, perhaps those of you who are singled out come up or just stand. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for three absolutely amazing talks. My question is for Anna and about the Cape in particular, because something that strikes me as so fascinating about this case, and I didn't know about the Scotia also being linked to the Cape, is that so many plants cultivated in the Cape Garden are almost always described in terms of some Indian Ocean location, like for obvious reasons in Asia, but then, very often places in South Asia, Madagascar, and Scotia and Yemen. So I'm wondering, something that seems to be emerging, at least in what I'm looking at in terms of the Cape plant and their links Indian Ocean world, is that there's a kind of implicit, some kind of explicit narrative of this reflects an ancient migration of peoples as well, because especially the Dutch of the Cape have this idea that maybe the Chinese, maybe Arabian merchants had been there before Europeans ever reached. So I'm wondering, especially in relation to this question of expertise and similar kinds of expertise in different parts of the world, is there, or have you come across any description of there are some people who are particularly good at cultivating or bringing these plants to particular places?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. The Cape is really important in the history of aloe because in the botanical gardens there was actually the aim of collecting different African species of aloe together. And it's, as I said, the entry point for a lot of those into European gardens as well. I agree that there's this sense of the Cape as being part of the Indies. And it's quite similar to that very early passage from Dioscorides that I showed, that Socatra is part of the Indies because it's on the route from the Roman Empire, in this case, to India. So it's it's lumped into this India category. And one of the things that I explore in the longer version of this paper is that I do is to engage with an argument that Benjamin Green made recently, that relatively few African substances have entered into the global exchange of materia medica in the early modern period. And Cape aloes are an obvious case in which that's not true. So aloe vera do come from Africa. We have clear reports of, there's clear evidence about how they were used in codified medicine and how that was adopted into a very hybrid medical practice at the Cape. And that's the source of Cape aloes. I think so I think this idea that it's part of India is one reason why that hasn't been noted. I'll stop there and we can talk.
Thank you.
Yes, the back.
So when we go about, I would like to ask about there. Yeah, you have mentioned this Bohemian Jesuit, and you have explored British archive. Have you still find something in Prague?
Not in Prague, in Brno, but yeah, I have
Yeah, he is only signed as a Bohemian Jesuit, or he was really living there, yeah.
No, he was born, I didn't really have the time in a 20-minute paper to go into the background, but he was born in Brno, he was trained in pharmacy in Brno, and then he was sent as a missionary to the Philippines by the Jesuits. So I did some research back in the Czech Republic. I'm Czech originally, so I have done my due diligence. There's a letter sent from him in Brno. That is pretty much the only source that can be directly ascribed to him. There are some relevant letters in Prague, but most of the materials that are useful are in Brno, where it comes to origin.
Thank you. That's great.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I just wondered if the, both what, in fact, all three of you really, one thing that ties your papers together is the use of paper. And in some ways it's about writing on paper, ink on paper, you know, which is a form of gall, of course. And then it's about the way the paper might be used to put plants on itself, or to communicate letters and books and so forth. And then, of course, you have the paper that's used in the various traditions. Some of it's not a paper, of course, in our sense, it's different materials in the Indian case. But I just wondered about whether there's a way in which that's a material, how that works in the Indian Ocean context, and what other materials are used for writing that might be relevant to these stories.
Okay, sure, I'll start. So originally, pre-colonial times, everything in India at least was either on bark or on palm leaf, right? Voracis flagelliformis. Now, the whole business of moving all this information onto paper was a source of a lot of friction for East India Company officials in India, because it just cost too much. And so you have William Jones writing to his younger colleagues and saying, do not put your translations on bad quality paper, no matter what they tell you, because it's not going to last. So it was a real source of tension.
I mean, in my case, in the Philippines, the paper that was most commonly used was Chinese or Japanese rice paper, which is particularly fragile. Even, you know, when you use it, but when you flick through the pages today, it sort of crumbles under your fingers. It wasn't very high quality paper, which didn't help with preservation. But two things that I would emphasize when joining on what Minakshi said about fictions is that, of course, there's a part of morality, of transferring knowledge onto paper, knowledge that was gathered locally and in cross-cultural encounters, which is something that I'm dealing with elsewhere in the book. What was the other source of fiction that I was going to mention? I no longer remember. Sorry, I don't have copy in the. Yeah, I'm sorry.
You want to comment then?
I don't feel like I had very much paper in my talk actually, but I was thinking about an image which I didn't have a chance to show, but it's from the Dioscorides, the Vienna Dioscorides, which is the illustrated version. It was made in the 4th century. And the illustration of aloes is just amazing because it's annotated with all of the different names. So it has the Greek name, it has the Arabic name, the Hebrew name, and they're all added at different stages of this illustration.
That's papyrus. It's on papyrus. I've seen it.
On papyrus.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but
I can show you when we get back to my show.
But an interesting image.
By the 17th century, some of it must be the discussions you're talking about are on paper. But by that point, a lot of the transfers have been made, sort of, talked about in some of the other papers.
Yeah, I think a lot of the discussion in the kind of medical and pharmaceutical literature is on paper, but then if you just look at the paper, you kind of miss the materiality, as you were talking about earlier, of exchanges. So when I looked at things like the gourd that contained the aloes and the monkey skin that contained the aloes, I had a completely different sense than I would have got from just looking at paper descriptions, I think. And you know, realizing that for people evaluating drugs in the early warm period, the senses were really important as well. So sniffing things, feeling things, are they crumbly, is it dry, you know, how do they taste? So those other senses come into play so much more. And I think actually we probably lose a lot just by over relying on paper discussions on paper.
That's
So this is a little bit inchoate, so I apologize, but as all three of you were talking, one of the terms that came to my mind was hybridity. That we talk about exchange, and we talk, I mean, especially and we were talking about place as, you know, important for understanding the aloe. And I think, well, what about crossbreeding? Of course, we're also talking about translation and stuff has changed through the translation and that kind of hybridity of knowledge transformation. So I don't know if any of you wanted to comment on that, but I just thought that's another piece of this puzzle.
Well, I called my book Hybrid Knowledge and I got into lots of trouble for that. I never said I wasn't. It does apply very well to aloes actually because it hybridizes very easily. And so I did wonder when thinking about aloe vera whether it was, you know, whether there isn't a clear origin place because it's a hybrid variety that's actually been created in this process of circulation.
I could just add it. If, you know, there are definitely serious problems with that, because for one thing, once you start speaking about hybridity, everybody will jump over you, saying you are posting essential types, which you are usually not. But I think the concept can really work if you pay attention to historical epistemology. And, you know, I borrow that from your ambassador. But that's where we can see the templates, you know, of bringing these things together. And then we have to stop and think about, well, does this count as a hybrid or not? I mean, it's a judgment call.
Yeah, I would agree, it's too static as a category.
It's too static as a
Something
category,
that's, you know, is constantly in motion as we saw with communication. Not to mention the linguistic rules for hybridity are also problematic, so.
Extremely
So, yeah, I'm not sure whether that's the most appropriate term to describe it.
We have one time for one more question. I think if we even stay, that's amazing. This is when our session is supposed to end, but with your indulgence, just one more question, which is coming from an online community. This is Tamara Caulfield asking the question that I was going to ask. So wow, if there had been time. I'm wondering if other speakers, thank you for your question, Tamara. I'm wondering if other speakers, let's say other than Anna, not that you can't jump in, but would like to speak to the question regarding, quote, the importance of place was gradually, let's say the naming of aloes, was gradually displaced by the concept of species and the isolation of active ingredients, which presumably also are places. Yeah.
I mean, I'll just one can start, I guess, because for me, species doesn't apply as extensively because I'm too early technically. Place is massively important. It really determines how individual kinds of plants are described and classified. What I find really interesting in the Philippines in particular is how these sort of commercial taxonomies, which are very much place-based, like that's part of the underpinnings of these place-based taxonomies, because you need to extract this commodity somewhere, you need to identify the place, and it's a very easy thing to do for a commodity. So these place-based commercial taxonomies seem to clash with botanical taxonomies. So you have Kamel, who is a pharmacist, but also a taxonomist. He tries to create a taxonomy of Philippine plants, and he really struggles to deal with it, because, you know, he says, okay, this is a It doesn't talk about aloes, but you can sort of imagine this is Indian aloe, this is Socotan aloe, this is Cape aloe. And he's only receiving these plants as commodities, right, in these gourds or, wrapped in skin or as processed. So what do you do in terms of botanical taxonomy? You can't do anything. So he perpetuates the sort of place-based taxonomy because he cannot go physically to the cave to observe the plants, right?
Did you want to add?
Just a note, because I work with botanists all the time. In the case of the spikenard, the organo compounds are weaker or stronger, depending on where the spikenard comes from. So if you get the Nepalese version or the Tibetan version that grows in the foothills of the Himalayas, interestingly, it's really strong. If you bring it to the Calcutta Botanic Garden, it's weaker, much weaker.
Thank you, everyone. I think we can conclude the session. Let's thank all three speakers.